Hello. Oh, God, I did it again. Hello. It's always the same. I said that yesterday. I need to find a new way. Good evening. Trouble is, that doesn't feel right either. Now, I'm sure there was something I was going to say. I can't remember what it is. Oh, well, never mind. Clearly, I'm getting forgetful rather young. It might be something to do with being stuck indoors too often. What do you think? So next week, half term. So normally, at this point, we would all be feeling sort of in the holiday groove. But of course, holiday is just going to be more time at home. Just I won't try and get the children to do any work. So it's not really quite like it usually is. So anyway, never mind. Gosh, need to get a grip. Need to get a grip. Come along, Julie. Right, chapter 14. Ah, yes, the feast. Hooray! Yeah, this is my favourite bit of this book. One of my favourite bits amongst all the books, as I think I was saying to you yesterday. So Jo and Lucy have been watching them getting all the servants getting ready for the Midsummers Feast, and now it's going to be time. Chapter 14. Jo hadn't really believed that this feast could be bigger or better than the two enormous meals he'd already had with Lucy's family. But the moment it began, he realised he'd been wrong. Once everyone had taken their seats, there was an expectant hush. Then from the castle entrance, a drum could be heard beating a lively rhythm. The people sitting at the tables below Jo and Lucy craned their necks to see what was coming, but they couldn't see past the crowd standing outside the hexagon of garlands. Who are all those people? Jo asked. They're villagers and peasants. Can anyone come? Yes, Lucy said, and they do, from far and wide. My uncle is famous for his hospitality. There's always food and drink for everyone, no matter how many come. And who's sitting down there? Jo gestured to the tables. Those are the invited guests. Nearest to us are the lords and ladies from the manors around here with their families. Beyond are the yeomen and tenant farmers with their wives and children. The crowd of villagers shifted. The drummer began to weave his way towards the dais, followed by two pipers, dancing and skipping through the throng. Behind them was the most remarkable sight. 12 swans gliding along on silver platters above the heads of the crowd. Their elegant necks were held proudly aloft, and their splendid white feathers were fluffed out as though they were swimming on a lake. They're not still alive, are they? Jo whispered. I hope not, Lucy laughed. They've been plucked, roasted and stuffed before the feathers were put back on. Jo gaped. They're so lifelike. Then he remembered something else. I thought it was treason to kill a swan. Not if it's yours. It's treason to kill an unmarked one because they belong to the king. But my uncle pays money to the crown to keep his own game of swans. You'll see when they get to us. Their beaks have a pattern cut into them to show they belong to Wardour. But why would you do that? Why keep them? To eat, of course. Jo tried to imagine his parents buying swan at the supermarket. What a bizarre idea. And yet he thought nothing of eating chicken almost every week and turkey at Christmas. He'd even had goose once. Why should a swan be any different? As the servants carrying the swans reached the dais, 2 roasted boars were brought out from the castle behind them, still on their spits. The others are being carved in the kitchen, Lucy said. Others? Surely those 2 will feed everyone. Her eyes danced. Those 2 are just for us up here on the dais. Jo whistled beneath his breath. This is mad. After the boars came a serving man bearing the magnificent head of a stag to herald what seemed to be mountains of venison. Then came beef and lamb and veal and capons and finally custard tarts. At the end of it, Jo sat back in his chair. That was fantastic, he exclaimed. I can't believe I actually managed to fit in dessert. Dessert? The custard tart. I assume that's it. That's the end of the first remove, yes, Lucy answered. What? There's more to come? Joe closed his eyes. We've already eaten as much as we did yesterday. Well, it is a feast, she said. Anyway, there's a short break now. Look, here come the entertainers. Joe opened his eyes again. From outside the crowd... Sorry, I've got a hair in my mouth. That's why I keep fiddling with my face. I can't find it. It's a hair of this variety, not of the four-legged type. I'd certainly know where that was. Look, here come the entertainers. Joe opened his eyes again. From outside the crowd, jugglers and acrobats were cartwheeling and backflipping their way towards the platform, leaping over one another, their batons and balls flying in wider and wider arcs. The crowd cheered as they somersaulted onto the dais and sprang onto each other's shoulders to make 2 pyramids 4 men high. Blazing torches whirled through the air from one human tower to the other, high above the heads of Lucy's family and their guests. Joe held his breath, both dazzled and alarmed by the speed of it. He'd seen this sort of thing on the television, but he'd never been right in the middle of it like this. They dived and leapt, threw and caught each other without a split second of hesitation. The smallest mistake would end in disaster. But they laughed and whooped as they defied gravity, and somersaulted away to roars of appreciation. No sooner had they gone than there came a fanfare of trumpets from the castle. I wonder what's coming next. Lucy could barely sit still. Behind the trumpeters, carried on the shoulders of a procession of serving men, were 12 peacocks on platters. Like the swans, they looked alive, their heads held high, their magnificent tail feathers fanned out behind them. Wow! Joe gasped. Lucy clapped her hands. Aren't they fabulous? Joe blinked. He could scarcely believe that the leading bird wouldn't strut away at any moment, indignant to be made into such a spectacle. But they arrived sedately at the dais and were duly carved and served. Chickens followed, an entire bird each, and then pigeons, mallards, curlews, partridges and quails. Joe had never expected to eat so much meat in his life, nor so few vegetables with it. At the end of the second course, he felt as though he would never eat anything again. While the tables were cleared, there was a great deal of shouting and laughing and raising of cups and goblets by the guests below the platform. Outside the hexagon, too, the villagers were clearly enjoying the party. "My goodness me, look what's coming now!" Lucy cried. "No more food, please," groaned Joe. "You don't have to eat much of this, or any at all if you don't want. It'll be very sweet." 4 men were moving slowly and carefully towards them, carrying the most astonishing model of the castle. It stood on a green board, its glistening white walls almost 2 meters high. There were red rosettes beneath the battlements and pennants fluttering above them. Every window glittered between its coloured shutters, and there was a portcullis of gold. As a final touch, this castle had been given a moat filled with real water. "It's incredible," Joe murmured. "What is it made of?" "Marchpane." "What's that?" Powdered almonds and sugar, I think." "Marzipan? Is the whole thing really built from marzipan?" She nodded. "Absolutely all of it will be edible. The subtlety master has really outdone himself this time." She dropped her voice. "You realise that's more sugar than most people out there would see in a year." The castle glided towards them and was presented to Sir Thomas and Lady Jane. Within minutes of its arrival, it had been dismantled. Soon not a crumb was left. It must break the subtlety master's heart, Joe thought, as he crunched a piece of battlement. Hours of work had been consumed in no time at all, and there wouldn't even be a photograph to remember it by. "Would you like anything else?" Lucy asked, when they'd finally finished eating. "Like what?" Wine? Cider? More beer? Joe put up his hands. I think I'll burst if I swallow another thing. I wouldn't mind a sleep, though. You can't do that, she said. There's going to be music and dancing. I can't dance, Joe protested. I'm not very good at the best of times, but I'll be sick if I have to do it any time soon. She grinned. Well, let's go and see what else there is then. She pulled him out of his chair by both hands, then jumped down from the platform. On the other side of the castle, from where they'd seen the barrels being piled up earlier, a stage had been put up beside the wall. A boy strummed a lute while another sang. People stood around listening and talking, their cheeks and noses red from the hot sun and all the beer they had drunk. Nobody was dancing yet, Joe was glad to see. Why don't we watch the acrobats again? He pointed to a crowd of people over near a pavilion. If you like, or we could go and see if the conjurer is here. He came last year, and he was so amazing. My uncle promised to send a servant to fetch him again. He comes all the way from Cambridge. Joe smiled. Lucy made it sound like Australia. But of course Cambridge was a lot further away for her than it was for him. 2 or 3 hours by car would be a full day's riding at least, probably more. They wandered on around the compound, picking their way through the groups of people sprawled over the grass. There were lots of children around, some of them playing tag, others chasing in a pack after some kind of misshapen ball. What is that thing that boy just kicked? Joe asked. It looks disgusting. Oh, that's a sheep's bladder, Lucy said matter-of-factly. We call that game football. Joe laughed. Doesn't look much like the football we play. Where's the pitch? Where are the goals? It looks more like a riot. She grinned. It is really. They know my uncle will turn a blind eye. To what? To them breaking the law. Only gentlemen with over £100 a year are allowed to play football, or tennis, or bowls, or cards, or most other games, in fact. Clearly none of these families have that sort of income. But that's really unfair. I suppose so. And of course you can't blame the children for being a bit wild when they've got a day off work like this. You mean school? No, work. But some of them aren't more than 6 years old. What work can a 6-year-old do? All sorts. Even a 4-year-old can be useful, picking stones off the fields and scaring birds away from the crops. Really? Joe was horrified. Don't small children get to play? What about their education? But Lucy wasn't listening. There he is, she cried. Joe was momentarily confused. Who? John Dee. My father says he'll be famous one day. Apparently he's incredibly clever. But I love the way he makes things disappear. That's the magician. For some reason, Joe had expected an old man in a cloak, a kind of wizard perhaps. But this boy looked about 18. They joined the crowd that was growing around him in time to see him pull a rabbit out of an empty basket. It was funny, Joe thought. Top hats might not have been invented yet, but the trick was otherwise the same. He and Lucy sat on the grass in the sunshine, while the magician did coin tricks and rope tricks and made a pair of doves fly up from his sleeves. There was a bunch of flowers which vanished and reappeared somewhere else, and the famous cup and ball trick that Joe had seen several times before but could still never work out. Just like the acrobats, these were feats of physical skill that had not been bettered in his own time. At last, the conjurer reached the end of his act. Drawn by the sound of music, Joe and Lucy walked back to where the lute player and singer had been. A band of pipers and drummers had taken the place of the two boys and were pounding out a vigorous rhythm with an exuberant melody over the top. The listeners had moved aside, and dancers now swung each other enthusiastically across the grass, skipping through the arches made by the other couples. Joe was surprised. From what they'd learned at school, he'd assumed that Tudor dancing would be rather more courtly. But since peasants hugely outnumbered noblemen here, and since a good deal of alcohol had been drunk by everyone, This was more like a chaotic barn dance. In fact, it was quite like the dancing at the Viking ship burial, except that every now and then one of the young lords would leap high into the air and try to kick his heels together on one side like scissors, usually landing in an undignified heap to peals of laughter. For some time, Joe and Lucy stood at the edge of the dancers, pointing out one couple or another, and clapping and cheering at the end of each dance. Joe was caught entirely off guard when Lucy grabbed his hand and pulled him into the middle. "I don't know what to do," he hissed. "You'll pick it up. It'll be much the same as the ones we've just seen. If you're not sure, copy that man." Joe gritted his teeth, annoyed. But within moments of the music starting up again, he remembered what fun it was to dance with Lucy. They swung each other wildly around, and he felt such freedom and happiness to be a part of all this that he was content to stay in the circle for the next dance and the next. They didn't notice that the light was starting to fade until someone lit the flares mounted on the wall behind the musicians. Out on the lake, flames began to leap from a bonfire that had been built on a floating platform, and at either end of where the dais had been, two enormous pyres threw clouds of sparks into the air. Joe and Lucy left the dancing and walked back to the front of the castle. The tables had been cleared away, though the hexagonal structure still remained. Candles hung from the garlands, and on the castle walls behind, torches blazed. At the edge of the compound, flames flickered along the top of the wall, and beyond it, the trees too were studded with tiny lights. The sky above seemed darker than it had been a few minutes ago. Suddenly there was an unearthly sound from outside the gatehouse. Joe peered along the track between all the people sitting and standing around. Through the gates came an outlandish creature, the height of a small house. "What is that?" he whispered to Lucy. "It looks like it's got 3 heads, and are those wings? It is a model, isn't it?" "I think so." She sounded uncertain. "I think those are people behind the legs. It must be part of the pageant. Remember the giant head we saw earlier with knives for teeth?" Everyone around them was moving now, clearing a path for the creature. Lucy and Joe backed away as it half slid, half shambled towards them. Behind it came a strange procession. There were weird, beaked creatures with fur and hunched over things with feathery backs and scaly limbs. There were birds with horns and creeping things with silvery bodies and ridges of hair along their spines. Even though he knew that these were people in costume, Joe felt fear stir in his stomach at the way they moved in the near darkness, coiling up and springing forward, or skittering sideways along the ground like monstrous crabs. Some flapped and swooped, while others squirmed like huge serpents. The flares they carried flung shadows this way and that, so that Joe found it impossible to keep his eyes on any single individual. But what really made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up was the noises they made as they advanced, baying and howling, clicking and trilling, whining, yelping and growling. And constantly, beneath it all, the sound of chanting, steady, ominous, getting louder and louder. He gripped Lucy's arm. She was trembling. "What are they going to do?" he said into her ear. "They're going to act out a play," she whispered back, "though this one looks like a nightmare. Perhaps it's going to be about purgatory." Joe and Lucy found themselves swept along with the crowd as it followed the procession around the castle towards the stage with the giant head. "I don't know about you, but I don't want to be at the front of this," Joe muttered. "Me neither." "Come on then." Joe caught hold of Lucy's hand and pulled her away along the tide of people. "We'll still be able to see most of it from the back." "I'm not sure I want to." They reached the open space at the end of the crowd. Joe breathed out in relief. "That was a bit scary," he said. A voice answered, right behind them. "Scary?" it crooned. "Surely not." Lucy and Joe spun round. One of the demonic creatures from the procession hovered right behind them, its body covered with coarse fur, its wings spread high above its hooded head. The face inside the hood had been painted black, so that only the eyes and teeth gleamed in the light of the bonfire. The creature lowered its wings. Joe thought he saw firelight flash among the feathers on both sides. "Surely Mistress Lucy is not afraid with her gallant saviour at her side?" mocked the creature. Lucy made a whimpering sound. Joe stepped away from her. "It's all right," he said, without taking his eyes off the creature. "I know who this is under the disguise." He cleared his throat and squared his shoulders. "It's Tobias. You'll be fine. It's me he wants." I think that's quite brave of Joe, to step away from Lucy so that she's safe, so that Tobias can take him on his own, because it is Tobias and it is Joe he wants. I love the feast. I quite like the pageant. It's quite creepy, but there are records of pageants like that, with plays about purgatory, which is where you went. I was talking about that the other day when I was talking about St. Christopher. If you died and you were unshriven, so you hadn't had the opportunity to confess your sins, you would have to go to purgatory before you could pass into heaven. And purgatory was a place of fearsome punishment where you had to atone for your sins before you could enter heaven. So yeah, some of these pageants I think weren't a whole bundle of laughs, probably quite frightening if you believed what they were telling you, which of course people did. Religion was actually a hugely controlling force on people in Tudor times. Another thing about this, this is a chapter that actually does have somebody real in it. John Dee, the magician, the young magician. He is only about 18 and he has come from Cambridge. And Lucy's father is right when he says that John Dee will be famous one day. He was a magician in his youth, and was quite well known for it, but he became a famous mathematician. I came across him the other day on the radio, actually. I can't remember all that much about him. Again, it's one of those things I knew about when I wrote the book and has since slipped away from my brain. Clearly this is a bit of a feature. Oh dear. There are many, many things I have known that I don't know now, but I know they'd come back quite quickly if I brushed up on it a bit. Really. So we have 3 chapters left. It is now the weekend. It's Friday, so I'm not going to be reading tomorrow or Sunday, and actually I'm not going to do Monday either because it's a bank holiday. I don't know whether my boys and I might go cycling maybe, but we have enough days in the week next week, even without Monday, to finish this book. So I will come back on Tuesday next week to read you chapter 15. And we'll do 15, 16, 17 next week. Maybe I might have a break on the Friday. And then the week after we'll start into the Demon in the Embers, which is the Great Fire of London book 4. So we'll start that after half term. But next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I think probably, we'll finish this book off. 3 more chapters to go. I hope you've been enjoying it. I'm rather enjoying rereading it because it's been a long time since I read it, as you can tell from the fact that occasionally I'm taken by surprise by something I wrote. You wouldn't think that was possible, would you? But it is quite a long time since I wrote this. What year did this come out? Let's just have a quick look. 2015. So actually I had finished writing it by now 5 years ago. So yeah, and when you're my age, 5 years, that's plenty of time in which to forget stuff, sadly. Ho-hum. Never mind. Right, I'm off to order the fish and chips, which, as you know, is an important feature of Friday nights around here. I will see you on Tuesday next week.